introduction to our presenters and say a few words about the format of today's event, and then we're going to kick it off. So Niklas Bremberg is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the Stockholm University and a Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Richard Gillespie is Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool. So Professors Bremberg and Gillespie will give us a rundown of their book for approximately half an hour to 40 minutes, after which we will have two excellent discussants provide their thoughts on the book. The first of these is Dr. Caroline Gray, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. She specializes in the politics of Spain and Europe more generally, with a focus on territorial politics and party systems. Our second discussant is Dr. Elisenda Casanas-Adam, who is a lecturer in public law and human rights at the University of Edinburgh, so a colleague of mine as well. She's also Associate Director of the Edinburgh Center for Constitutional Law. Dr. Casanas-Adam works on, among other issues, comparative public law, with a focus on plurinational constitutionalism and referendums and self-determination. Of course, I could say much more about each one of these presenters, but I would much rather that you hear what they have to say. So Drs. Gray and Casanas-Adam will be speaking for about 10 minutes each after the book's presentation. After that, I will let the book's authors have a chance to respond to their comments, and following that, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. The event is scheduled to last up to 2 hours, but of course, which is good that we have this kind of extra space. The typical length of events for CCC is approximately an hour and a half. Our hope is once we kick things off and open the floor for questions from the audience, that you might be willing to unmute yourself and appear on the screen as you're asking a question. So I would ask you to use the raise hand function once we open the floor. But if you're unable for whatever reason or unwilling to participate in that manner, and if you have a question, please feel free to pop your question in the chat. Of course, I will prioritize the questions that are coming live from the audience. And on that note, we are going to start with Professor Richard Gillespie.
With Niklas, in fact.
With apologies, clearly, yeah, overwhelmed. Niklas, my apologies, go right ahead.
Thank you, Karlo, and thank you very much to the Center on Constitutional Change for hosting this event and giving us an opportunity to present our book. We are, of course, very grateful and happy for this occasion. So I'll try to share my screen and put this little presentation on. I hope you can see it.
We can see it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so I mean, what we thought would be useful is that we quickly present a little bit kind of the thinking that went into the project, why we kind of wrote the book to begin with, what kind of inspired us, and then kind of walk you through, even though rather quickly, we hope, the kind of the main parts of the book, the theoretical argument, the research design, and then also the findings from the comparative study as such. So I think, I mean, many of us who are interested in European politics and have an interest in kind of EU studies have been for a while now in a territory that we are seeing, and we are trying to kind of grapple with the phenomenon of increasing politicization and contestation towards kind of core themes of European integration when it comes to the kind of the power and the competences of the EU. The literature has had, I think, a lot of attention and focus on what we are usually referring to as Eurosceptic movements and parties that are politicizing aspects of European integration and EU membership for electoral advantages, kind of politicizing Europe in that regard, often from kind of maybe a right-wing populist angle. But we are seeing other ways, and we think this is also an interesting observation that made us think more about these kind of issues, where we see that there are instances of kind of challenging the political status quo in Europe and the EU, but not necessarily power and competences of the European Union as such. And we were observing these kind of phenomena, for instance, in relation to parties and movements that are making independence claims for what we call non-sovereign regions in EU member states, such as Catalonia and Scotland, at least up until Brexit. We thought that there was something interesting there that we kind of need to dig deeper into. Both Rich and I have been following Spanish politics for a while, and we were seeing kind of dynamics around the issue of particularly Catalan independence that were not aligning with what a lot of the previous literature were suggesting that we should see in a place like Catalonia, and also in relation to as an effect of Spain's membership of the European Union. And also with that, we saw movement and dynamics in Scotland that kind of also made us think that there is more here than maybe the literature was paying attention to, at least at this time. This is again when we were talking about this project, and finally we got money for it, and then we were able to conduct our study. I mean, we saw, of course, something that also informed our thinking is that we saw from over the recent decade and kind of a steady increase in the popular support for independence, both in Scotland and Catalonia, from kind of a position around or the decade before 2010, where popular support for Catalan and Scottish independence were kind of a sizable share of people, but still not an overwhelming majority. It was a kind of a sizable minority, around perhaps 20 or 30%, but then steadily growing after 2010 and onwards. We have seen political, of course, shifts in both these places, where and political equilibrium in Catalonia before 2010, where kind of both unionist and regionalist parties were kind of somewhat happy with a political status quo for Catalonia, kind of seeking maybe enhanced regional autonomy, but not necessarily independence, and then has shifted to a place where we are now, when there is a majority in the regional parliament in Catalonia, with parties that are advocating for independence rather than increased regional autonomy. And of course, in Scotland, we are seeing a political development where the SNP, the Scottish National Party, are in a position of dominance now, where it has perhaps was not as salient up until 2007. And of course, in the Scottish case, it's interesting to reflect upon these dynamics, since a lot of observers are suggesting that the electoral system in Scotland was more or less designed not to kind of produce this kind of outcomes that we're seeing in terms of the dominance of the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. But so to us, there are kind of trends when it comes to public opinion, but also electoral politics that suggest that we need to start thinking much more serious about these matters, also in relation to stuff we said earlier on the relationship between independence claims and European integration. And something that kind of also caught our attention when we were thinking about this project and making sense of some of these observations that we were seeing and discussing, was that if you look at the literature on the kind of the relationship between European integration and regional secessionism, or secessionism in EU member states, you had one pretty well articulated strand of the literature that was making what we were thinking pretty theoretically well advanced arguments about the effects of European integration on kind of the appeal of independence claims in regions such as Catalonia and also Scotland before Brexit. And that literature was suggesting that the effect of economic integration within the European Union and the enhanced possibilities for regional elites to exercise political influence and gain economic benefits from European integration would over time decrease the mobilizing appeal or the appeal for independence in regions of EU member states. And you saw we just saw empirical studies on this, but we also saw, I think, interesting theoretical arguments being made there that kind of made sense up until a point. But then obviously you saw the developments that we have seen after 2010, and we'll also seen and kind of another strand of the literature suggesting something very different, that namely that the relationship between European integration and regional secession might be actually the reverse, that it is as an effect of European integration, the attractiveness might kind of independence claims might go up, so to speak, due to the combined effects of kind of being part of a common market that would kind of lessen the importance of being part of a national market, since now there is a big European market, and then the kind of the institutions of the EU and the pooling and sharing of sovereignty are making small European states appear perhaps more viable in the lingo of this theory, more viable in the eyes of regional elites and citizens. So the effects of European integration might actually be reversed than the kind of the other strands of the of this literature would suggest. So we thought that this is of course an interesting conversation to have between those two, both rather well articulated positions. But then again, of course, something that would complicate the kind of the viability theory is that if you look at what the EU and its institution has actually said, and in response to independence claims in regions of European Union member states, particularly the Prodi doctrine, the kind of the response from the European Commission from 2004 and onwards, is that it would suggest that kind of independence would come with high costs for regions of EU, that there is no automatic kind of route to EU membership if independence were to be achieved, even though of course there has been an academic debate around the Prodi doctrine itself. But to us, this suggests that there is more to be done here also in kind of theoretical terms in order to address or kind of wrap our heads around the relationship between European integration and independence claims or regional secessionism in this European context. And we are in the book drawing on works by Lisbeth Huge and Gary Marks in what they frame as kind of the post-functionalist theory of European integration that puts an emphasis on, of course, the role of political entrepreneurs in EU and European integration, rather than assuming maybe that many theoretical frameworks tend to do, that there is kind of at the bottom of some kind of an economic rationale or an economic logic behind independence claims. So whenever kind of regional elites see that there is an economic gains to be had with independence, they might pursue that and then try to convince voters and citizens in these places that independence is something it would be beneficial. That kind of story obviously downplays dimensions that we think are extremely important to take into account, that we would rather kind of put under the rubric of maybe cultural and ideational factors too. But still, I think the kind of the key message from the work from post-functionalism is that we really need to kind of think much more serious about the role of political entrepreneurs in politicizing and making use of different ideas and versions of Europe and European integration in relation to what we are now seeing as the emergence and or perhaps the increased salience also of independence claims in places like Catalonia and Scotland. So that is something that kind of informed our theoretical framework that we use as a starting point for our analysis. So just quickly to summarize our argument, we depart from an idea of regional secessionism in the European Union as being something that includes political projects that seeks to turn a part of an existing EU member state into an independent state. And I think maybe that's the kind of the important part about regional secessionism is that we are not necessarily thinking about, I mean, we are open to that the kind of the boundaries of any particular entity that a political actor is seeking independence for, so to speak, claiming independence for, is not necessarily completely congruent with a kind of political borders made up within states. For instance, there is an element of contingency there, but we think that whenever there is that kind of a region there that the political actors are seeking independence for within EU member states, then there is something that we are interested in. Of course, that maps onto Catalonia, but also Scotland, we think. Then we think it's important, and we think we do this in our book to kind of advance our understanding of the similarities and differences between Catalan and Scottish independence claim, since it's important to acknowledge that not all political projects that are demanding greater regional autonomy in the EU entail secessionist claims, that there is, as we also saw, for instance, in the case of Catalonia, that there might be shifts over time here, obviously, historically. So there is kind of a need to kind of go deeper into these cases, and that's also why we wanted to do this kind of comparison. And Richard will talk more about, I think, the kind of our findings and the kind of the limits and possibilities of our comparison in the Scottish and the Catalan case. But I think the main thing here is that we are arguing that it has to be better explained and understood how and with what effects claims to defend European values or to forge an ever closer union of the peoples of Europe can, in practice, be made to resonate with claims for Catalan and Scottish independence. And I think that's something that we really kind of add substance to in our book and through our analysis. Super quickly now, before I turn or hand over to you, Richard, I think it's important just to highlight that the empirical analysis that we do cover the period from 2010 up until 2021. That we are relying on original data, semi-structured interviews. We have done about 20 with political representatives from pro-independence parties, and we also draw on public opinion data and research on attitudes towards European integration, EU membership, and support for independence in Catalonia and Scotland. And also a big part of the empirical analysis is also draws on official statements from national and regional governments, as well as party congresses and electoral manifestos from pro-independence parties. And of course, this time has, of course, provided us with ample material, since there has been several elections in the UK, of course, during our time period, and also in Catalonia. Great. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Niklas. Taking the comparisons further, let me outline some of the reasons why we took these two countries together. First of all, both of them saw the EU framework as making the creation of an independent state, a new state, less costly and more viable. Both of the independence campaigns reached a peak at around the same time, and we felt that there was, to a great extent, their fates seemed to be linked. There was a belief, certainly within the movements, that if one of the pushes for independence succeeded, the other would find it easier to go through the same door. Its credibility would grow. People would believe in victory. Also, they were seen as, from the EU, very much as being in the same packet, as being a common challenge, although that has changed somewhat during the course of the two processes. And then the very fact that they sought to advance their independence claims through, by means of a referendum, also unites them very strongly, although of course constitutionally this is much more problematic in the Catalan case than in the case of Scotland. Historically, the framing of independence within a European context has not always been present. Clearly, we know SNP earlier on had been opposed to the common market. It was deeply divided. Scotland was deeply divided over Europe, as was the rest of the UK, and continues to be. Whereas, of course, the Catalan parties, the mainstream ones at least, have always been pro-European. From their origins, they have not only been pro-European, but have felt European. It has a lot to do with the geographical position of Catalonia, but there's this sense in Catalonia that they are in some way more European, in fact, than the rest of Spain. Not necessarily true today, but that is the claim. Of course, this situation has been modified to some extent by the emergence of the CUP, the Candidatura de Unitat Popular, which of course is anti-EU. It sees the European Union as a capitalist club and so on. But it's interesting that the CUP doesn't actually come out and say we're against the EU. It very rarely says that. It mutes its opposition in the interests of trying to develop a united independence movement with the other forces within Catalonia. Also, whereas the SNP had advocated independence since its creation, of course, the Catalan parties, again with the exception of the book, but the mainstream ones, Esquerra Republicana, Convergencia Democrática de Catalunya, were autonomist originally, and took up independence relatively late in their political histories. And that was partly because, a number of reasons, but partly because of the way in which the European Union had itself developed. By the 2010s, they saw the EU as having developed in an intergovernmental into an intergovernmental entity, far more so than a federalist body. And the conclusion they drew from this was that in order to have effective representation within the Union, one had to have a state of their own to really represent their interests. Both structurally and strategically, the two cases provide variation. Clearly, structurally, SNP has largely dominated the independence movement in Scotland, whereas in Catalonia, there have always been a number of different political parties, particularly since the 1970s. And you've also got very important civil society organizations, such as the Assemblea Nacional Catalana and Òmnium Cultural. They, particularly 10 years ago, they were real drivers of the independence process. So it's not simply sort of party-led in the case of Catalonia, somewhat different to the case of Scotland. In fact, since 2015, I think, as has been mentioned, there has been collaboration between no less than 3 parties. That majority in the Catalan Parliament that Niklas mentioned relies on collaboration between today's Junts Party, the Esquerra and the CUP. So clearly there are important competition dynamics within the independence movement in Catalonia, and I think one has to say that's a source of weakness, and one has seen those differences renewed and exacerbated in the last few years. Strategically, they're different as well because of the much stronger legal basis that exists in Scotland to demand a referendum and demand negotiations with Westminster. The difficulty in Catalonia of not being able to organise it, the Catalan government not being able to organise itself a legal referendum means that the movement has relied much more upon popular mobilisation. It has challenged legal constraints, and it has been looking to outside mediation to try to shift a quite adverse balance of forces in relation to central government in Spain. And these differences have in fact, these latter differences have affected the way in which the 2 parties regard each other. One of the things that we looked at was the interactions between the parties, and one sees that the SNP has been much more reluctant to align themselves closely with the cause of Catalan independence because it is associated with unconstitutional actions and so on. That being said, I think one has to differentiate between different levels of the party, and one saw at the SNP conference in 2017 that the rank and file and good proportion of the members of parliament were really pushing hard and wanted a stronger expression of solidarity with the and of support with the resolutions that have been passed on independence in the Catalan Parliament. I turn just now briefly to European responses, EU responses to the movements, because we're interested in the dynamics both from the parties' perspective. That's our main focus, but we've also been looking at how we've tracked how the EU has responded over the last decade or so. Clearly, the fact that these parties have, over the years, greatly Europeanized their discourses hasn't been particularly beneficial in terms of trying to change EU attitudes towards them, at least not initially. The EU has seen them as separatist. They don't call themselves that. And clearly the EU has got a big concern about fragmentation, the possibilities of instability as well. I mean, already, with so many member states, it makes it much harder to coordinate and pursue the objective, the ambition to become a real global power. There was, of course, a shift in EU attitudes towards Scotland in 2016, or from 2016, when the UK voted to leave. That wasn't part of a broader shift. That was very clear because Brussels continued to disappoint Catalan independence parties. In particular, 2017, the Commission refused to get involved, to mediate, when there was this direct confrontation between Catalan voters, or a proportion of Catalan voters, and the Spanish police. But we argue in the book that intransigence on the part of Spain under the Rajoy government, and perhaps it's not exaggerated to talk about an overreaction on the part of Spain in sending in police and trying to prevent people from voting and so on, has eventually brought some benefits to the independence parties, which are a result of their efforts to internationalize and Europeanize their cause. The fact that many people outside saw Spanish government actions as repressive, they felt in many cases that the courts were issuing excessive punishments in relation to the referendum of 2017. That we feel brought more sympathy. We've found more indications in the European media. There have also been a number of very significant legal pronouncements against extradition and so on. All of this, to some extent, I think for the Catalan movement, it kind of vindicates their Europeanization and their Europeanism. And this helps to explain why there hasn't been a strong Eurosceptic shift in Catalonia as a result of the events of 2017. Our research concentrated largely on the period of the 2010s. And I think one issue to consider is whether perhaps the similarities between the two cases has been reduced as a result of Brexit. Clearly that did affect the SNP case for independence. Back in 2014, the SNP had been able to offer Scottish voters a sort of halfway house, that there would be this vision of independence within Europe, but with many aspects of the existing union, the UK union, being retained, including sterling, monarchy, all kinds of things, subject to negotiation, evidently. But of course, post-Brexit, the picture would be very, very different. The case that the SNP would need to make ahead of a second referendum would have to engage with the possibility or the fact of the creation of a border being on the table, and Scotland being required to join the Eurozone. So clearly, Brexit's been a game changer to some extent. On the other hand, while the fact that Scotland voted differently to England and the UK majority in the Brexit referendum, while this gave an initial boost to the SNP and led Nicola Sturgeon to be feted in Brussels, we feel the actual hard form taken by Brexit could count against the party's prospects if there were a second referendum. The last point I'm going to raise, because this was one of the less expected aspects of our research, was the extent to which themes of democracy or arguments about democracy came forward from the independence parties. And we think this is an area that there's plenty of potential for further research. Clearly, the emphasis or arguments about democracy were likely given that that people have been demanding referendums, and the parties have been well aware that support to be consulted, support for the idea of being consulted by Scots and Catalans has always been higher than support for the idea of independence itself. In some of the Catalan interviews, for example, we found that some party leaders were saying that the right to decide was more important even than independence. That was absolutely key for them. That there had to be a consultation, and it was about being sort of Catalonia growing up and being treated rather differently by Spain. Equally, the emphasis on democratic claims has to be seen in terms of a battle that is still being waged, particularly in Catalonia, to change the perception of what the pro-independence movement is all about. Catalans, in particular, are seen as the independent sectors are seen as problematic because of the way in which they raise cultural issues, language issues. They have, during the debate on the European Constitution, they pushed very hard on the idea of making Catalan an EU official language. That maybe fed some of the misperceptions or the perceptions, depending on the way that you see it, of whether Catalan independence is about an ethnic form of nationalism. To what extent is it identity-based? SNP doesn't have the same sort of problems because it's a somewhat different form of variant of nationalism. But also, we argue that the claim of independence party leaders to representing a democratizing project that is not just a matter of elite deployment of a discourse in order to advance the cause of the party. It also reflects changes, societal changes, demographic changes that have been taking place, and in particular in Catalonia. I always talk more about Catalonia because I know so much less about Scotland. The massive growth and dynamism of the independence process owed an awful lot to the way in which younger people came into politics. Sectors of non-nationalist opinion joined the movement about 10 years ago. Its ranks became greatly diversified. Some of the attitudes within the parties became modified. So we have to take on board the way in which evolution, in the Catalan case, has had the effect of bringing teaching of Catalan as a mode of delivery of education in schools in Catalonia. Many young people today not only are speaking Catalan, but also they regard Catalonia as their main point of reference, rather than the whole of Spain. We do in the book, perhaps even post-book, because clearly it went to press perhaps about a year ago, slightly less. We do regard both processes as being somewhat stalled at the moment. There's clearly a concentration on other issues, COVID, and all these other things have come along. But we do feel that this is a particularly fruitful area to do some further research around this democratic debate. Independence is the big issue, of course, but it may or may not provide answers to the actual grievances that Scots and Catalans have. I think we've been questioning that to some extent in the book. But what is also clear is that in both countries, you still have unitary states, which, following extensive devolution, remain very much under pressure, that they are not providing solutions to the grievances that many Scots and many Catalans have, and that they themselves will need to change and adapt in the future, rather than simply become or remain defensive in their attitudes towards these challenges.
Thank you, Richard and Niklas. Thank you very much. I think we can proceed perhaps with, I'm not sure what the order was originally, but Caroline?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, obviously, firstly, I'd like to congratulate the authors on their publication and also on the publication format they've chosen, actually. So they've chosen to publish this as a short form book under the Routledge Focus series. So for those who aren't familiar with that, longer than a journal article, but not a full monograph. So it's ideally suited to a topic like this and makes it a concise, easily readable text. So no excuses, folks. The book's theoretically very well grounded. I mean, the authors construct an analytical framework that draws upon and nuances some existing frameworks, particularly in relation to the study of European integration. But I think beyond that, the key value of the book, for me at least, lies in the in-depth empirical study that the authors provide of the evolution of discourses on Europe and European integration from pro-independence actors. I mean, personally, through my own research, I'm more familiar with the situation in Catalonia than the situation in Scotland. And so much of the literature on the Catalan case has focused on analysing the range of domestic, political, social and economic factors that have shaped the independence movement. So, for example, you have lots of literature on relations between Spanish and Catalan governments, or within Catalonia on the relative role of political elites versus civil society in shaping the independence movement. So this book complements that literature by focusing on the lesser studied question of where notions of Europe and EU integration fit within pro-independence discourses and the extent to which the one shapes the other. And so there's that side of the contribution to the literature, as well as what Niklas was mentioning of contribution to the literature on EU integration by looking at different forms of criticism of the EU that are not traditional Euroscepticism, more being in favour of the EU, but wanting some changes within that. So I think there are two factors I'd like to highlight about the author's approach in the book that I found particularly insightful or helpful when reading it. So firstly, I think the essentially constructivist approach the authors take in their analysis of visions of independence, visions in plural, and visions of Europe and EU integration, I think that allows them to provide a fully nuanced account of these visions and the debates surrounding them. And these nuances are really key to some of the book's findings. So one of the author's main conclusions, for example, is that most pro-independence parties continue to be broadly supportive of European integration, despite the rebuffs they've often received at EU level. And the authors argue that this has been possible in part because these parties have gradually adapted their vision of Europe and the EU in their discourses. And Richard touched on this in the end of his comments. So, these pro-independence parties tend to articulate and deploy notions of Europe and EU integration based on democratic ideals of what the EU could be and what form a democratic community of European people should take today. So this is the argument that the authors make. And in so doing, these pro-independence parties' discourses move beyond the old trope of a Europe of the regions, which, back in the 1990s, there was a lot of optimism around this, but it's disappointed since. And so these parties' discourses now situate the discussion on the role of different territories within the EU within a broader dialogue on how to strengthen democracy and the sense of community among European citizens today. And so that, the authors argue, is one of the key ways in which pro-independence parties reconcile their visions of Europe with their visions of independence. And as the authors point out, that also moves the discussion on how to further democratize policymaking in the EU beyond traditional discussions just over whether or not there's a democratic deficit between your state and your supranational level. So that's kind of the first key point I wanted to make. And then the second factor I'd like to highlight concerns the methodological approach the authors have taken. So as Niklas explained, the authors analyse and account for visions of independence and integration by analysing three primary sources. So first, official party discourses in a range of forms. Second, assumptions and calculations by party elites, and they glean these from interviews with politicians. And then thirdly, public opinion as reflected in public opinion data. And I think, this use of a range of data is one of the book's strengths, because it's what enables the authors to uncover the range of visions of independence and integration and how they've been deployed and to what effect at different stages over time. So, for example, in the third chapter on Catalonia, the authors show how official party discourses do reveal how parties' messages in relation to Europe have changed over time. But really, it's the elite interviews with politicians conducted at various stages of the independence push that have allowed the authors to provide deeper insights into how party elites' strategic thinking in relation to Europe has evolved. And I think also, the inclusion of public opinion data here is interesting and very useful, because even though the authors aren't concerned with providing any direct correlation between party discourses and public opinion towards the EU, it does allow them to reach some provisional conclusions in terms of how and why party discourses may have evolved or been received in certain ways at different times, or why, for example, rebuffs from the EU at certain points may or may not have affected public opinion on independence, and what implications that's had for party strategies. So, in light of these points, really, I've got perhaps two main questions for the authors that perhaps could serve as a starting point for discussion when we get to the Q&A. So firstly, obviously, as Richard touched on in his comments as well, you suggest in your book that appeals to democratic ideals in pro-independence parties' visions and strategies feed into broader debates on how to further democratize EU policymaking, and you suggest that this happens in ways that go beyond traditional discourses, traditional discussions of whether or not there's a democratic deficit. And you suggest that this is quite an interesting area for future research. So could you perhaps elaborate on the nature of these current debates on EU democracy, how they differ from just your traditional debates over the democratic deficit, and where you see pro-independence parties' discourses fitting within that broader picture. And also perhaps you might want to touch on there, obviously in your book you talk a lot about pro-independence parties seeing this as kind of a vision of their democracy, the same kind of debates that are happening within the domestic context, they're seeing within the EU context as well, wanting more of a right to decide. But obviously that could spark criticism from commentators, a number of whom might see the Catalan pro-independence project as not being democratic. So, perhaps you could discuss a bit more how you see this vision of democracy and your understanding of it within this context. And then secondly, given the importance of different sources you've used in your analysis, perhaps you could tell us more about the insights you gleaned from elite interviews and how they complemented or added to the insights that you got from publicly available discourses and data. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much again for a very interesting work. I enjoyed reading it.
Wonderful, Caroline. Thank you very much. Elisenda, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Karlo. I would also like to start off by thanking you and the Centre for the invitation to participate in this event. It's been a pleasure to read the book and to participate in this panel. I think I have to say I'd written this down in my notes, but also after hearing both the presentation of the book and the initial commentator, that I think my perspective is slightly different after reading the same book. This is probably because I am a lawyer and not a political scientist, but hopefully my comments will also be relevant and still helpful for sparking some discussion. So as I said, I enjoyed reading the book. I think it's extremely comprehensive. It's very detailed in its research, in its coverage and its analysis. So, I mean, I think overall it's an impressive source of information for anybody who's interested in the development of the Catalan and the Scottish independence processes. So I think this also highlights how the EU dimension is such a central one in the case of these processes. So it also highlights, the importance of the contribution made by the book. I think the book also makes a very good job of highlighting both the similarities and the differences between both the Catalan and the Scottish context and processes, and how, due to this, the leaders have made sort of different use of the EU or appealed to the EU's institutions and bodies in framing their case for independence. So overall, I mean, I think the greatest value of the book is that the very detailed analysis that the different chapters provide, so the excellent discussion that they provide of the kind of dynamic evolution, so of the changes of these visions of Europe, which are presented or held by sort of pro-independence leaders or citizens in Scotland and Catalonia. Firstly, with reference to sort of significant domestic changes and developments, so how domestic developments shape the way that sub-state leaders or citizens view Europe or try and appeal to Europe as part of their pro-independence process. But I think secondly, and also very important, is the excellent discussion of the dynamic evolution of these visions of Europe with relation to the developments of the European Union itself. And this has come up a bit in the initial presentation, how the EU has progressively changed from a very much kind of international organization of states focused on sort of commercial, economic matters, to what could be considered by some now kind of quasi-federal sort of state where sovereignty is shared. So we see an evolution of these visions of Europe in relation to these developments, and then focusing on more recent times, also in particular in relation to the responses of different EU institutions and representatives of the member states more broadly to Catalan and Scottish processes. As a result, I think it is a book about Catalonia, it is a book about Scotland, but I think it's also very much a book about the current state of the European Union and of on one of its current, I think, most significant challenges to its democratic and constitutional architecture, which is kind of accommodation or integration of sub-state peoples, nations, or units or regions as they're referred to in the book. So as I said, I enjoyed it, but I do have some comments I would like to raise, questions for further discussion. I suppose the first one is, in the book, sometimes there's references to the internalization of the conflict, or the Europeanization of the conflict, either in relation to Scotland and Catalonia. And also, for example, here in the presentation, we've seen references to some of the developments post 2017 referendum in Catalonia. So some of the decisions by courts or different EU member states as an example of Europeanization. But I suppose I would view this differently, and I would argue that maybe what the book shows clearly is that actually in the context of a kind of highly integrated European Union, these processes or these movements within an EU member state are also by definition European processes or European movements, which have an impact on the European Union. If successful, will require action, will require response, will require change in the European Union, and therefore that they're not really internal matters as they are presented as such sometimes by the member states. Building on this point, a second one, which is that, the introduction, and again, we've seen in the presentation, but we see this in the introduction of the book, they speak about, or the authors speak about the theories that have argued that EU integration would reduce nationalist claims on the one hand, or on the other, theories that could argue that EU integration would actually facilitate sub-state secession processes. But again, I think maybe for me reading the book, an interesting element that stood out with me, and it's particularly obvious in relation to the discussion of recent Catalan developments, is that actually what the book seems to highlight is that in the case of an EU member state, the secession of a sub-state unit or sub-state region would be extremely difficult, or even arguably practically impossible, without some sort of guarantee of remaining in the European Union. And as I said, for me, the most obvious example, again, we discussed in the book, is in relation with developments in Catalonia, whereas the book tracks or highlights very well, the EU was consistently hostile to any appeals, to any claims by the Catalan leaders, by the Catalan movement, and even supported the kind of very strong overreaction by the Spanish authorities. But still, and the authors, so I'd be interested to hear their view, sort of seem maybe slightly surprised or highlight as a point the fact that, excuse me, that this has not led to a rise in anti-EU sentiment, for example, in Catalonia, or it has not led to, for example, the formulation of a case for independence without remaining part of the EU. But I suppose my question here would be, would this really be a realistic option for a political party to put forward within a kind of EU member state? So in the current multi-level integrated EU, would Catalonia really have any other realistic options? And again, I think the difference is shown when we look now at the case of Scotland, that suddenly the debates and the situation have changed due to Brexit, and Scotland finds that it has to, in a way, choose between remaining in some sort of union with the UK or looking towards the EU. Then my final, suppose point, but also partly question, is that, I think, again, the processes or the movements in both Catalonia and Scotland, and I suppose this links to the comments about democracy and the aims of democracy. I think both of these processes are engaging very much with the vision that the EU puts forward of itself as a kind of constitutional and political order, which is based on the union of different peoples or nations, based on the principle of democracy, human rights, ideas of democracy, or share, where sovereignty can be shared. But what we see also in the development of this vision that the EU presents of itself is that no real voice or influence was given to sub-state nations or units, and also more recently that there's no avenues for them to become a full member state and therefore benefit from this framework through enlargement via secession from a member state, so through internal enlargement. So I think in this case, sub-state units or people are left in a largely impossible situation. I think this comes out very much in the book, and is addressed in the conclusion of the book when considering, the democratic challenge to the EU political order that are posed by these processes. And I suppose I wanted to ask the authors a bit more about their conclusion, because they seem to indicate that, or they seem to suggest that the appropriate question to be asked in response to these challenges is how these sub-state peoples or regions could contribute to strengthening the EU's multi-level democratic system. So I understand this is meaning, giving them more voice, more participation within the EU structures themselves. And obviously, more generally, I would fully support this. I think for democratic reasons that this is an important shortcoming of the European Union. But again, the book itself, I think, notes very clearly that both these processes, so the Catalan process and the Scottish process, have arisen largely due to dissatisfaction with the functioning of domestic democratic arrangements. And this is how, just to answer the question about, why these are processes that are arguing for further democracy. Obviously, they're unsatisfied by the way democracy works at the level of the state. In many cases, the parties in power at the state are maybe not the ones that have been voted or have the majority at the sub-state unit, and therefore they are arguing for democracy to be brought down at the lower level, but still remaining part of the EU. So this was my final question: is would giving them, or these sub-state units or representatives, further voice and democratic engagement within the EU really resolve these issues, or could these types of processes still arise? I suppose my view here would be that obviously why this is also important, there also needs to be, to resolve this democratic deficit, some form of process to enable internal enlargement within the EU. So that was all I had to say. I hope that all made sense. As I said, it comes from a slightly different perspective, but hopefully, yeah, it also helps the discussion.
Thank you very much, Elisenda. So what I propose we do is perhaps leave it to Richard and Niklas to address some of these points, perhaps address some of the questions, and then turn it to the audience. So Richard or Niklas.
Shall I go first?
Go right ahead.
Well, thanks very much. I think there's some excellent questions there. So I'll try and answer the easy ones and leave the difficult ones for Niklas. First of all, yeah, Caroline asked, yeah, that I think one very important point she made was that the Catalans are not simply criticising what the EU is, but are framing many of their arguments in terms of what the EU could be. So it's very much, it is a forward-looking kind of debate, and I think that it ties in with what Elisenda was saying about the future of democracy and so on. Essentially, what the Catalans have been saying, especially since 2017, is that the EU should be upholding its fundamental values. I think they've brought this into the debate far more than in the past. In the past, they were fully supportive of all steps forward in integration. Defense policy, what have you, single currency, everything. They were there in the forefront. And now they're saying, however, that recent events have demonstrated that the EU is kind of abandoning its so-called core values. So I think that is that's really important. Rather than Euroscepticism, what one has seen in Catalonia has been an attitude: we remain European, but we support a Europe that is going to be developing, addressing its democratic deficit, but essentially upholding European values, democracy, human rights, things like this, which of course, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the Ukraine conflict plays into this. with the war being depicted as an international contest about these issues as well. Caroline also asked about how the fact that we had a number of interviews added value to the information that we derived from party congress documents and things like that. We were a bit disappointed in that we didn't have more interviews. I mean, we were overtaken by COVID, and it really just to negotiate interviews is far harder when one is relying on social media, internet, etc. But thinking back, there were some extremely useful interviews where we just got a different level of understanding. We found that some party leaders or representatives really opened up about what their assumptions were about what the EU, how the EU was going to respond. We were able to ask people like Alfred Bosch, who was in charge of the external relations of Catalonia at the time, do you really expect the EU to mediate on your behalf? And so on. Now, he wasn't clarifying this at all in the public domain, but he said openly to us, well, no, we have had high-level diplomatic exchanges, and it is clear that they will not mediate before we manage to create a crisis in Catalonia. We have got to mobilize, bring it to a point of confrontation with the state, threaten instability, or the situation would threaten instability. And in those circumstances, the EU, or maybe not the whole the EU, may not be official top-level EU actors, but member states, some form of European involvement may become more possible as there is concern about how the situation will play out. The EU clearly doesn't want a protracted standoff within a member state, even if it's not a violent one. Elisenda's questions started off with 2, but I think it developed into about 4. But they were all very good ones. You asked about, yes, I mean, clearly the first one, the EU clearly does need to respond. We're fully in agreement on this. In the book, I think we talk about the Committee of the Regions as being one area where, although it's become commonplace to say, well, we've had that debate, it's in the past, the regions, well, some regions won and some regions lost. The ones that feel that they are nations, that so on, those that have got more legislative power feel that they should be differentiated. This is an area surely that the EU could reconsider. You know, it's not well, everything is pretty politicized, obviously, and there would be resistance among cities and among some of the other regions to modification of the status quo. But clearly this is an area where Scots and Catalans might build alliances themselves, and where one can see pragmatic concessions being made conceivably. Equally, I think the idea of internal enlargement has been mooted. It has been raised. I think there's still scope there. If these situations continue for a long period of time, then surely the EU cannot simply say it's for the member states to sort out these problems. They have to consider themselves, what is in the interests of the European Union? Is it really in the interests of the European Union for Catalonia to be lost in order to uphold the rights of the member state Spain? Clearly not. Catalonia is important to Europe. Catalans are Europeans already, and so on. One of the issues I think I'd like to raise here, I'm not sure I'm actually answering the question, but one of the Catalan arguments is that Brexit has shown that simply getting rid of a member state is not a simple matter. It took several years, a lot of waste, well, I won't say wasted negotiations, but yeah, rather unproductive negotiations and so on. They kind of cling on to this as saying, well, okay, we may be told if we have a referendum, if we get a mandate, which they're far from at the moment, then the EU wouldn't simply say Catalonia is out. There would be a long period of negotiation during which there could be parallel negotiations potentially on accession. So that has encouraged some people in Catalonia to not be so fearful of the possibility of exclusion. How democratizing or pro-independence elites could actually contribute to democratic development of the EU, I think is also a very good question. The contention in Catalonia would be, I think, about partly about the importance of the economy and important to keep it, but also that democracy is also about diversity, about cultural diversity. And we're talking about a living language here, spoken by 10 million people. They would argue that that would be a form of contributing. And they would also try to remind EU leaders that Catalans have already contributed an awful lot, say, in terms of filling posts of responsibility within the European Commission, in relation to Mediterranean policy, in relation to developing external relations with Latin America. So they would point to all of these things, I think. Niklas, will you add?
Thanks, Richard. Just, I think, two short or brief points to add to what you just said. First, thank you, Caroline and Elisenda. I think you made a very, kind of nice overview of our book, and we really appreciate your comments, and then also your questions. So I think, firstly, to the point that Caroline raised on kind of methods and different sources of data, to me, I also kind of, as Richard said, saw this as a particularly interesting part of this project. And I remember our discussions going into it. And then, of course, COVID happened, and we had to reshuffle some of the kind of planned interviews. So instead of hanging out more in both Edinburgh and Barcelona as we had planned, of course, that was the enjoyable part of the project that did not happen, but we managed to spend some time in Barcelona before COVID, actually, but still. So I mean, hanging out in these places and actually having a feel for a little bit more of the everyday of making these independence claims, how political parties are actually moving in their immediate political surroundings, in a sense, to kind of make an impact on how people experience these movements, would have been an interesting part. And I think this is still could be something for future projects, even though, as Richard said, maybe we're now in a situation where kind of some of that energy that we were observing and feeling after 2014 and around Brexit in 16, and then around the referendum in Catalonia around 14 and 17 may not be there to the same extent. But I think the performative aspects of this political projects is something to dig deeper into in the future. And I think Richard mentioned some of the interesting insights we got from interviews from our Catalan interviewees. I think when apart from stuff that we got from our Scottish interviewees was very interesting, I think, to kind of shed a light on how members of the SNP was actually grappling with this kind of emerging and more salient kind of hard issues around a potential Scottish independent state and its relationship with the rest of the UK, the border, of course, and currency issues and other very I think contentious issues in relation to EU membership. So kind of just get a sense of how these political representatives are kind of thinking about these things and being willing to talk about them is, I think, was an important part of that part of our project. Now, I think many of the points and questions raised that Elisenda raised ties into Caroline's first question on kind of, what kind of research can we do or imagine in relation to the question on kind of democratic contestation. Richard have, of course, touched upon that. Also, I think, at least to me, when you look at the part of the literature that is now perhaps moving into more nuanced, and this is your, I think, point too, Caroline, that kind of one thing that you're appreciated with our book was a kind of nuanced discussion. I think we can also see that there is more of a nuanced debate around democracy in the EU, also in the literature, where more and more researchers are acknowledging that there are not only kind of the big grand theory debate of whether you should federalize and then that would solve the problem of democratic deficit in the EU, or you renationalize and have as little common decision making as possible, and that would be the other solution. I think a lot of scholars are now in a position where they would acknowledge a whole range of trade-offs and dilemmas. Whenever we kind of invoke ideas of representation, accountability, sovereignty, citizenship, or whatever it is that we are kind of thinking of as core themes and concepts in democratic theory, and apply that to European integration. I think a lot of us are in that position now, and I think our small investigation and the kind of the discussion we want to contribute to goes along those lines. We need to start paying more attention to these trade-offs. And to me, I think one of these particular trade-offs that we perhaps are not exploring fully in the book, but that's for maybe a future project, I'm writing a paper on it, is the kind of the idea on voluntary political association and what that does to our understandings of self-determination in kind of European and multi-level governance or democratic multi-level governance in the EU. And of course, I mean, if you think about that, and you think about how do you kind of then find some kind of a practical expression around that, then obviously you would also start to thinking about how can we ensure that there is that voluntary political association, not only towards the EU, but also within EU member states, within political communities that obviously are feeling able and capable of making meaningful political demands for themselves, kind of represent themselves, so to speak. Whether that's purely conceptual or it actually has some kind of normative implication, this is for future discussion perhaps. But I think that is to me is something that we might want to dig deeper into in the future too. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both Richard, Niklas, of course, Caroline, and Elisenda as well. At this point, I would invite the members of the audience to raise their hand if they wish to ask a question. So you can do that if you're not familiar with Zoom. That actually refers more to me than probably all of you. Down in the reactions button, there's a raise hand function. I do have a few questions in reserve, just in case we're kind of waiting for that. I do also want to remind people that, or members of the audience, that they're far more likely to get their questions read out if they're placing them in the chat, if those are in the form of a question rather than lengthy commentary. So are there any questions at this particular point? I'm actually not entirely sure where to, let me see, participants. So I do not see any raised hands. I'm not sure if that's correct. And if that is the case, I hope you, Richard and Niklas, you do not mind a question or two. One kind of thing that was floating around my mind as I was reading the book, but also listening to both of you speak was, so it's more a question of kind of politics rather than theory. And that is, if you were considering, both as you were writing the book, but also as you were, engaging with your interlocutors, who the audiences are really for these kinds of claims, these visions as they're articulated in the public domain, and if there is a kind of hierarchy of these audiences in terms of who really counts for the visions themselves, and who is perhaps more incidental. I'm not really sure if that makes sense, but I hope it does.
Well, I guess, yeah, the target audience. Well, we have obviously been looking at diverse sources, so some of the discourse that we have looked at is clearly aimed at the rank and file and to kind of reinforce the movement itself. But the strategic bit and the decisive bit is clearly, it's about trying to get to that 50% majority in society. Parties have struggled, haven't they? I mean, in some cases, of course, it hasn't been clear really what a majority would be or what it should be to be valid as some kind of forming some kind of mandate to proceed or to force a realistic negotiation with the host state. But I mean, essentially, the dilemma is that the support has been mostly in this range of 40 to 50%, hasn't it? So it's building upon that among people who are not sort of traditional nationalists, who have doubts in part about the EU issue, but also about many other issues. So it's about reassuring that those people, how they identify who they are, because it's just almost like a mathematical equation, isn't it, rather than a sociological group that are defined. But yes, I suppose through opinion polls, through surveys, they have some ideas, which I don't think any of the political leaders who we asked, who we interviewed, spoke about that, and nor did we ask directly about it. So I think that is a very good point in terms of where we should be finding out more about who they're aiming the discourse at.
Thank you. Niklas, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think first, one thing is obviously when you do kind of an historical, or if you open up for kind of an historical analysis, obviously then you're open up to the fact that there might be changes over time here, of course, also in terms of if you just focus on the kind of the strategic aspect of party representatives, political actors, how they kind of view their visions and construe them to have some kind of a political effect, then obviously that can change, and also as a consequence, as a response to events, but also as a kind of some kind of a learning process here. I think that's something that we saw in the Catalan case to a certain extent. The Catalan case is also maybe more complicated because there is, as Richard also mentioned in his part of the presentation, is more kind of plural political landscape also when it comes to the independence camp. So some of these actors might be tempted also to think about kind of, okay, so what kind of vision should we push for here in order to maybe get an edge also towards our competitors within the same camp in order to try to gain or get to a hegemonic position, for instance, in the independence camp, which has been one debate here, and that of course is something that would then kind of go towards the rank and file, the voters, so to speak. But I think that is what it has always been present, is that two-sidedness, that there is the obviously ambitions has to be directed towards the rank and file, but also international audiences. And I think that's fascinating in the Scottish case. At least this is, I think, my, and I hope our interpretation of kind of the evolution of the SNP discourse on Europe, particularly after Brexit or kind of around Brexit, where the SNPers obviously have come up with the slogan or the trope of kind of the independent Scotland in an integrated Europe, and around Brexit and after Brexit, to that it was added the kind of the sense of normal countries in Europe seek common solutions to kind of collective problems within common framework. That's what normal countries look at Sweden, look to Denmark, look to Ireland, small normal countries, they seek EU membership, whereas Brexit is some kind of an anomaly in European politics. So that's a way, obviously, to kind of distance Scotland and Scottish politics from the rest of the UK, which to me sends a signal both to Brussels and other international audiences, as well as to the rank and file in Scotland, and perhaps also those voters that were hesitant towards independence in 2014, but very dissatisfied with Brexit in 2016.
Great. Thank you, Niklas. Andy Karl, you have a question. Go ahead.
So my name is Andy Karl, and I'm not an academic, but I am following and engaged in these processes, and I really appreciate I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I will read it after this presentation, but I really appreciate your presentations and the questions. And the thing I'm interested in trying to have a better understanding of is that I'm fascinated by certainly on the SNP's part, their political reluctance to be seen to be to be associated with or to show any kind of public solidarity with the Catalan independence movement. And then also the acute divisions within the Catalan independence movement, and how that is sustained. And my question is, if I'm trying to formulate, is something along the lines of, what is it about how do the way that European institutions play roles that they act as a factor to help sustain some of these either the divisions within the Catalan independence movement or the reluctance for kind of a voluntary association and solidarity between the SNP and the Catalan independence movement, and might there be areas in which the European institutions or actors could actually be playing a more constructive role on what seem to be potentially constructive processes, like the very slow moving, almost invisible political dialogue going on between Spain and Catalonia, and perhaps the future political dialogue that's going to be necessary between Westminster and Holyrood. So I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about how they, what are the factors that get in the way, and the factors that could help to make, could actually be more conducive to, I don't know, collaboration between those two independence movements and also in terms of the EU institutions playing a constructive role to support these processes of conflict resolution, dialogue, and problem solving. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And finally, we got to see you. My apologies for that. Niklas or Richard, who would want to take that question?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I suppose, I certainly agree that the EU potentially could play a more constructive role in encouraging dialogue and constructive debate between host states and so-called regional governments. But I think the EU, in the Spanish case, I mean, it's very, very different now to the UK case. In the Spanish case, I think it feels it has to uphold and support Sanchez. Sanchez is one of the the main bastions of the EU at the moment. I mean, one of the among the medium countries, if you like, who's very much in line with EU leaders, very pro-European discourse, etc. And they recognise that on the issue of Catalonia, he's got a very difficult game to play in this dialogue. I mean, you're right. There's hardly anything happening in the dialogue, and I don't think it can be sustained very much longer unless they come up with some kind of political ideas or formulae to discuss, even if it's just an enhanced statute. But I mean, clearly in other parts of Spain, any concessions to Catalonia would be hugely unpopular, would have tremendous costs for the Socialist Party, and would be implacably opposed by the Partido Popular, especially now that it's climbing into bed with Vox in governments in certain regions. So yeah, I think there is a dilemma for the EU as well. On paper, we can see that they could be playing a constructive dialogue. I think it would have to be, for those reasons, a constructive role behind the scenes. It wouldn't be open diplomacy or open exchanges.
Just to add to that, I think one kind of constraining factor is here that to the extent that you could argue about the strategies that party leaders and leaderships in Catalonia were willing to kind of adopt in order to kind of raise the stakes, so to speak, around Catalan independence ahead of the unconstitutional referendum in 2017. You can argue about that, but I think it's important to take into account that if seen from the outside, that this is so much in breach against with the constitutional order and the principle of rule of law. That makes it, I think, difficult also for, we saw that from the SNP, right, that it was extremely difficult for the kind of the SNP leadership then to kind of support these actions, whereas of course there was perhaps broader sense of sympathy within the rank and file of the party towards Catalan independence movement and activists. I think that's one factor that might explain the SNP's reluctance a little bit, and also, of course, the responses from EU institutions. So whenever, and I guess this kind of goes back to Elisenda's points about the kind of that not trap, but position where the Catalans are finding themselves in that almost impossible position, in the sense that they would demand self-determination within Europe, but the kind of the current structures that they're in seems to impede that, and I think that's the kind of the strong idea of the importance of the principle of rule of law is really something that structures these dynamics.
Thank you, Niklas. Michael Picken. Michael, I'm going to try to. There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Like Andy, I'm not aligned with any academic institutional study. I'm actually a retired university administrator who worked for 40 years in universities. And one of the things I had to do in that role was explain the rules for classification of EU students for tuition fees. And towards the end of that process, the list of exceptions got to be greater than the list of 27 then EU member states. And it raises in my mind the question about this, Elisenda, I think, raised very importantly, about the question of what is the EU's attitude towards territorial integrity within the EU, because there are countless examples of where the EU has operated what I would consider a pragmatic approach. Algeria, going back to the Treaty of Rome, Algeria was a member of the EEC and left. We have the Danish examples of Greenland and the Faroe Islands, which are outside the EU. We have the French examples, not just Algeria, which left, but places like French Guiana, which is actually bigger than the majority of European Union member states, but isn't actually in Europe, but is considered an integral part of the European Union. But also in the case of the UK, we have the specific examples of Gibraltar and the special base areas in Cyprus, which had totally different legal relationships with the UK, with the EU, despite having the same legal relationship with the UK. So it seemed to me that the EU operated in a pragmatic way in relation to its member states that I would say is characteristic of a multi-governmental formation rather than a trans-governmental formation that looks to its wider interests. Because so long as the member state agreed that that was the exception that it wanted, then the EU was happy, even though it led to all kinds of anomalies like Gibraltar and the special base areas, totally different relationship. But in the issue now is that we have a situation in which the UK is outside the EU, and therefore Scottish leaving the UK becomes part of an accession thing. And again, the EU seems to have operated pragmatically in relation to this idea that it opposes succession. And I put the example of Slovenia in particular, which broke the Yugoslav constitution in becoming an independent state, but the EU immediately recognized it, despite the fact that its succession, and it argued it wasn't a succession, so we're into this complex situation about a breakdown in a state about that. But I would say that was characteristic of a pragmatic and a multi-governmental response rather than the trans-governmental defense of the interests of the whole. But the specific question I want to ask is very recent, which is about the decision of the European Commission on Scottish admission to Erasmus. Where you had this campaign by members of the European Parliament, 100+ members signed a letter to the Commission, led by, I think, a German Green MSP who had undertaken their Erasmus, I think, at the University of Edinburgh, or certainly in Scotland, campaigning for Scotland and Wales to be permitted to join Erasmus, despite the UK government pulling them out. There seems to be no legal reason as to why Scotland and Wales couldn't join Erasmus. They are nations, and it doesn't define, the Erasmus regulations don't define nations and states at all. In fact, states are not mentioned. It's only nations that are mentioned. And Scotland as a nation has had a separate education system anyway. But the European Commission did decide that it wasn't going to allow Scotland and Wales to join Erasmus, which again seems to be operating in a multi-governmental. It's taking the view that the UK government has sovereignty over this issue and not the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Senate. And therefore, I wonder how much that influences the theoretical underpinnings of this, that the EU is opposed to succession rather than it's pragmatic, and therefore there are all kinds of possibilities in future.
Thank you, Michael.
No, I think thank you, Michael. Excellent points. I don't know anything about the recent developments when it comes to the Scottish admission or application to become part of Erasmus. But I think a lot of the issues that you raise and the examples that you raise are I think we all see them and agree to them. Then I think you ended with the question on okay, so what are the theoretical implications of this? And I think for instance, for discussions on European integration and regional secessionism as a part that we entered or started with, I think it's definitely something that needs to be recognized and has to be there, in a sense that, as you say, the EU can be apparently very pragmatic and find a range of different solutions to accommodate different and apparently pretty complex interests, as long as member states say fine. That's okay. We can live with that. So obviously that thing sends a signal, and I think that's something that we also discuss in our book, in a sense that learning process, so to speak, happened definitely within the Catalan elite, certain parts of the members, not least the old Convergencia, which is now defunct, in a sense that they saw that there was a clear limit for how much they could kind of push their interests within the current framework, because at the end of the day, in order to really be kind of have a say out over those exceptions, have a say over the kind of the pragmatism, the limits of pragmatism in the EU, you need to have a seat at the European, or at the Council, basically, the kind of that body. And I think that's also something that you would see in the SNP, at least up until Brexit, in the sense that in order to protect Scottish interests fully, we can't rely on Westminster. We need to have a seat in Brussels. So of course that would enforce that kind of what did you call it, not multilateral, but the kind of multi-state dynamic to it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but I think that there's some useful examples there given by Michael of the pragmatism of the EU. And I think as long as the movements can maintain their pressure, they don't necessarily have to be on the verge of a majority, but they have to remain substantial, and they have to remain united. They have to keep raising the issues and continue with their external activity. Excuse me, my throat's going.
Cheers, thank you, Richard. I'm canvassing for the questions. I don't see any hands up. We do have a little bit more time. I did wonder, there was kind of a question occurred to me, which is, a comparison between the situation with Catalonia and Scotland. I mean, Scotland is now in the situation in which Catalonia was between 2012 and 2017, in the sense that the regional government is asking for a referendum and the central government is saying no, right? And of course, the European Union did not really show itself to be particularly interested in, I think for some fairly obvious reasons, intervening in the debate. But the clear and obvious answer to that is that, of course, Spain was a member state. UK is no longer a member state. Now, so I'm going to ask you an unfair question that requires some mental gymnastics, which is, assume that Spain is not a member of the European Union, and thus not in a position to veto any sort of EU coordinated response to any kind of potential Catalan scenario in Scotland. Do you think that the EU would be, under any circumstances, likely to basically start exerting any kind of diplomatic or other pressure on the UK to basically concede a referendum? And again, completely aware of the fact that this is a very unfair question.
Well, I think the mechanics are the mechanics are slightly different, aren't they? In that Scotland, faced with rejectionism in London, not good, has the recourse to the law courts, and they could win. I mean, they could gain success there. Maybe Niklas has something.
Yeah, Niklas, if you want to go ahead, so that
exactly. So Richard could catch his breath. I just got a kitten in my lap now. Okay, but no, I think, but it's interesting because it kind of your question, Karlo, kind of asks us to think about what would be the conditions under which the EU would somehow kind of take action. And I think. And again, to me, it kind of goes back to the notion of, or perhaps the perception of democracy. If the case could be made for kind of a non-member or within a non-member, that fundamental democratic rights were somehow not respected, I think I can't imagine now, at the top of my head, kind of concrete measures or stuff like that. But I could definitely see some kind of a discourse emanated from the EU saying, "Look, we're concerned about the state or the state of affairs in Scotland and the rights, the democratic and fundamental rights of Scottish people." But of course, I mean, I think that we're very far from that happening in a sense, because of course you could always say that no, it's democracy in the UK is well and alive, from at least from an outside perspective. So I think, but that to me, yeah, I think that would be, the kind of the imaginable, conceivable kind of thing that you could possibly start saying something about. Look, we're concerned about the democratic and fundamental rights of the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Richard. Are you better?
Better.
Okay. So if you don't mind continuing your point, I think you were basically caught midpoint.
Yeah. I just think the process would be very different. It's not. I mean, the domestic sequel to that would be just as important as the one between Brussels and member state.
Sorry, yeah. Okay, thank you. It happens. All right, look, so I don't see any questions, and we're at any rate quite close to the 2-hour mark. If there are no others, I just want to thank all 4 our panelists, obviously the participants, our authors, Richard Gillespie, Niklas Bremberg, and of course our discussants, Caroline Gray, Elisenda Casanas-Adam, and all of you for joining us for this event of the Center on Constitutional Change. Thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day, and hoping to see you on another occasion where the CCC organizes a book talk or another talk of this nature. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.